For a while now in gaming, there's been discourse about whether turn-based games still deserves its time in the sun. A product of simpler and less advanced times, turn-based games have long faded from the limelight and center stage of gaming, being relegated into a more niche market. So when 2K Games announced that they'll be rebooting the cult classic turn-based strategy and tactics franchise XCOM, all eyes were predictably on them, waiting to see how it would turn out. Most of us today remember how well XCOM Enemy Unknown performed, becoming a modern classic the day it hit store shelves, and also spawning an equally successful sequel in XCOM 2. What I believe few will remember is how this might not have been the case originally. 2K Games' original reboot announcement wasn't for the fan-loved Enemy Unknown, but instead for a wholly different, almost forgotten beast. Hey Kings, what is poppin'? It is me, Cheems of Regret. Today we're looking at the game that 2K quickly memory holed in favor of the more fan-pleasing and more successful Enemy Unknown. Today we're looking at the Bureau XCOM Declassified. Following the implosion of the original franchise publisher, Microprose, at the turn of the millennium, the XCOM games were pretty much dead in the water. Despite efforts from various dev teams to create a spiritual successor, few stuck around, and none raked in the big bucks the same way XCOM did in the past, and would in the future. Things somewhat changed in 2005. In that year, 2K Games not only got their grubby hands on the XCOM franchise, but also took in Firaxis Games, which is a studio founded by original XCOM developers. Many fans were hopeful for the franchise to return, but it'd still be a bumpy road ahead. 2 XCOM projects were greenlit by 2K. One project was by Firaxis, and this would end up becoming the XCOM games loved and adored by fans. The other was run by 2K's Marin and Australia studios. The in-house project went through a lot of ups, downs, stallings, communication breakdowns between the Marin and Australia team, and even an identity crisis or two. Geez, that sounds a lot like my life. Anywho, a lot of ideas were thrown around as to what kind of game this XCOM was going to be in the first place. At one point, an asymmetrical PvP game not unlike Dead by Daylight or Evolve were pitched. Another idea was a 4-player cooperative shooter a la Left 4 Dead. Eventually, the devs settled on the idea of making a first-person shooter with an emphasis on horror and stealth elements. This original idea would see players take on a terrifying and mysterious alien force, where players had to investigate the aliens from the shadows, slowly learning how to fight this new threat. The project didn't go very well, as the aforementioned communication problems between the Marin and Australia offices often caused development to stall. After years of grueling development, the Marin office officially took control of the project, as the Australia team was assigned to support the development of the BioShock game. This meant that the Marin team could push out a functioning demo by E3 2010, as a game that was simply titled XCOM. Although I personally thought the game itself looked somewhat interesting, fans were predictably disappointed. Many thought that 2K Games weren't interested in actually making a true XCOM successor, and the project predictably took a lot of flack because of it. 2K Marin's project took another round of shellacking the next year, when Firaxis Games' XCOM Enemy Unknown was revealed to much fanfare. It was at this point that both 2K Games and 2K Marin agreed to delay and reboot the project. This time, the devs would take many cues from the sister project at Firaxis. The game would also largely abandon the horror and mystery elements in favor of being a squad-based tactical shooter. The project would be re-revealed as the Bureau XCOM Declassified. It would release in 2013, 1 year after Enemy Unknown. The game is set in the 1960s in the backdrop of the Cold War. You play as Agent William Carter, who is recruited into the secret XCOM organization to fight a clandestine war against the invading alien forces known as the Outsiders. The game starts fairly simple, with Carter doing what he can to help XCOM beat back the aliens, but there's a few twists and turns in the story that one normally wouldn't expect from this fairly average game. The Bureau would get a middling reception, with review scores averaging around 6 to 7. It also had the displeasure of launching in a cramped and competitive week, fighting against Volition's Saints Row 4 and Ubisoft's Splinter Cell Blacklist. The Bureau's disappointing launch would see 2K Games largely leave the XCOM franchise to Firaxis management, with the publishing company only overseeing various ports to consoles and mobile platforms. Now let's talk about the game proper, starting with the visuals. When it comes to visuals, the art team mostly nailed it here. I say mostly because how pretty the environment gets can vary wildly depending on where the mission takes place. For the most part, missions taking place in cities, bases, farms, towns, these all look pretty good for the time this game came out. You really get a feel that this game takes place in the 60s, with all the classic Americana aesthetics you'd expect from it. The art design mostly falls flat in missions that heavily feature alien architecture, which just looks bland. They feel sterile and bereft of anything interesting. I mean, it could be an intentional thing considering the overall themes and plot of the game, but come on. At least put some extra flair on these otherwise monotone gray blocks. Where the regular buildings, architecture, and decorations give some illusion to the players of lived-in spaces, the blocky dark gray architecture used for the alien structures makes no such attempts. You look at these warehouses, streets, and gardens, and you believe that they're warehouses, streets, or garden. You look at the alien rooms, and it's blatantly clear this is just an arena or a corridor for you to pass through. It's a shame because Enemy Unknown, with its purely grid-based top-down map design, can create alien-themed arenas that puts up a much better illusion. In terms of textures and graphics, well, it's a late PS3 360 game coming out in 2013. It looks and feels like a game from 2013 for better or worse. The texture work is pretty alright, though sometimes the skybox can look like it's a low-resolution painting. But fortunately, that is a rare occurrence, so I can let this slide. Character models and face textures were definitely not made equal. Important characters are modeled and textured nicely, while side characters seemed like the devs barely got enough time to work with them, which probably isn't too far from the truth considering the game's rushed development. The particle effects can get pretty good, but Nvidia physics will fuck with the frame rates, more on that in a bit. If you're playing this game on modern Xbox consoles, since they're available via backwards compatibility, the game probably looks pretty alright. I don't have an Xbox though, so I can't really verify. Otherwise, it doesn't look all too different from the average third-person shooter of the time. Something that can get pretty hit or miss are the game's animations, especially when it comes to the facial animations during dialogue. While the main character holds up pretty well, it's mostly the side characters that get the short end of the stick. I've mostly noticed this on Weaver, which is a very important character in the game. At first I thought her dead, soulless eyes were a one-off thing, but then I noticed she consistently gets the short end of the stick when it comes to animations. Like, there's this scene where it looks like the animator slapped a 1911 on her hands without properly modeling her fingers around it. Shortly after that, her fingers clip through the pistol grip as if the mocap actor didn't have a mock prop and the animators just slipped the weapon in. That's it for the major gripes though. Everything that's left are minor issues, like playing the game in higher FOVs on PC might reveal some of the jankier leg animations, which I can't really fault the game for. You're not really supposed to play the game like that anyways. It would have been cooler if they put in the effort to make it work, but given the game's troubled development, I understand why they left some stuff a bit undercooked. What definitely didn't age well were the pre-rendered cinematics that came with the game. Like, Christ, I'm sure you could get some shit done with them, but come on! There are better ways to do it. Now it looks like the remnant of a past that nobody wants to remember, in an otherwise alright looking game. The resolution looks way too crunched on modern monitors, and the frame rate feels pretty choppy compared to the mostly steady 60 FPS the rest of the game runs at. The in-engine cutscenes were great and stood the test of time, where the pre-rendered cutscenes looks all scrunched up, blurry, and just god-awful. This is genuinely frustrating because it takes away from a few scenes that should have otherwise felt impactful, because sometimes they're so goddamn blurry you can barely make out what's going on. So to summarize, the in-engine visuals are mostly solid, pre-rendered stuff holds up like ass. Now on to the game's sound. The game's sound it's a bit of a mixed bag. The game's sound effects, cues, and overall ambience is actually pretty good. Weapon effects are nice to listen to, and it's fairly easy to pick out what's going on, which weapons are being fired at you, and so on and so forth. Your squaddies will react to the fight, calling out threats and keeping you updated. They even have some nice banter every now and again, which is always neat. What does feel disappointing is the original soundtrack. While the few licensed songs in the game are good at setting up the feeling that the game is set in the 1960s, they're few and far in between. The original soundtrack, on the other hand, well, it's a bit generic. It works, but it doesn't go above and beyond. This is especially disappointing because Enemy Unknown came out the year before, and it had Michael McCann composing its OST. The Enemy Unknown soundtrack is so good. When they added it to XCOM 2, I opted to use the older soundtrack and never looked back. Coming to the Bureau after Enemy Unknown, I was expecting something of the same caliber. Honestly, if it had a good soundtrack like that, it would have really elevated the game from mid-tier to above average. Mediocre soundtrack aside, the real problem with the Bureau's sound department is how buggy it can get on occasions. Sometimes scripted dialogue will play over each other, making it hard to hear either. This usually happens when you accidentally trigger banter while the characters are still talking, which makes it a bit frustrating since you have to purposely slow down your progress in order to listen to anything. Another issue is sometimes the sound just doesn't play. There are moments where you can tell some kind of sound effect is supposed to play, but nothing comes out. So you could have a massive explosion or a burst of energy play out in the background, but you don't hear any boom or any crackling energy. It's weird, and it unfortunately yanks you out of the game.
So be it. Prepare the ship for immediate departure. We leave as soon as the device is installed.
Now, before we get to the core of the game, we have to talk about stability. Now, the game mostly runs fine on modern hardware, but it's not the best when it comes to optimization. Given that this is a game from 2013, I foolishly thought my 1660 should have been able to run it at max settings with all the bells and whistles enabled. Oh, how foolish was I. Predictably, NVIDIA's physics technology lies at the heart of most of the Bureau's stability issues. Physics Cloth outright crashes the game for me, while Physics Particles can bring your frame rates down to single digits when subjected to intense scenes. Do yourself a favor and disable these outright. Apart from the eye candy, you're not missing much. Besides those few gripes, any gaming PC, or even laptop, reasonably worth its salt, should be able to run this game at a stable rate, though do expect the occasional frame dip on heated moments. Now let's finally get to the fun stuff. Gameplay. When it comes to the Bureau's gameplay, the game is... well, it is what it is. When the devs rebooted the game's development, they said it was to make the Bureau more in line with the tactical spirit of the XCOM series. While they sure tried their best to do that, the game really just feels like a more tactical and micro-intensive version of Mass Effect 3. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, nor am I really saying that's a good thing. Again, it is what it is. Aside from being your run-of-the-mill post-Gears of War third-person cover shooter, the Bureau really... and I mean it really wants you to command your squad properly. Your character, Carter, isn't all that powerful on his own. I mean, sure, he's got some cool abilities and you could pop consistent headshots with your cracked aiming skills, but the game is designed so that it's quite troublesome to try and solo encounters. For example, enemies hiding behind cover aren't just harder to hit, they take less damage as well. Flanking them not only makes it easier to hit them, but also increases the damage they take. With that in mind, you're going to have to plan out engagements. You could choose to pin down enemies yourself, or you could get your squaddies to do it while you flank around. Maybe you can engage in the American way of war by applying overwhelming firepower on literally everything that moves. Really, it's whatever you can do with the tools handed to you. A gripe I do have with the squad command system is how you order your squad around. Now, there is a single use button which orders your squaddies to either go to a location or to focus fire on an enemy, like in Binary Domain or in Mass Effect. But if you fully relied on this, you wouldn't be using your squad to its maximum potential. For this, you're going to have to use the command mode. The problem with the command mode is that the command marker, which guides the squaddies to either use an ability on a location or to move to said location, the command marker has to navigate the map geometry the same way the player does. So you have to manually drag the command marker to the spot you want your squaddie to move or deploy an ability on. But you also have to go around the cover scattered across the arena. This can get super finicky, especially when there's elevation or separate platform. It can come across especially frustrating because the game runs on a permadeath system, where all squaddies that die on the field are gone forever. When your squaddies die because you couldn't finagle with the command system properly, you are going to be pissed. When it comes to difficulty, the game does start a bit on the tougher side, but this is almost exclusively because you start with none of the good gear and abilities that has the potential to turn your squad into a rolling death ball. The starting weapons you get, the M14, the 1911, the trench gun, they're fine against easier sectoid enemies, but as the game starts pushing outsiders as the main workhorse enemies and mutons become increasingly common, even the mighty M14 and its 7.62 NATO cartridge is gonna start feeling like a bit of a pea shooter. This changes dramatically the moment you start getting alien weapons. For better or worse, the game's threat escalation and difficulty climb heavily hinges on what gear you have available and what weapons the enemy is shooting at you. Well, at least until the final level when the game quits with complexity and resorts to throwing everything it can at you, at once. I said earlier that you have to use your squad's ability to properly come out on top on a fight, and that consistently popping headshots alone wasn't going to get you through a level. Now this is true. The problem is, outside of your squad members' abilities, their damage contribution to firefights can be lackluster, to say the least. Now don't get me wrong, your squaddies will be stacking bodies with you. It's just that you'll be doing the vast majority of the killing, at least until the endgame when your squad's equipment is advanced enough that they're just as dangerous as you are. Did I mention that the game's moment-to-moment difficulty depends on the gear you have equipped? Like, I'm sorry for harping on and on about it, but seriously, in the mission where you first get to pick up a laser weapon, the aliens just kind of stop being this overwhelming menace. I mean, sure, they're still dangerous, but you're going to pay less attention to positioning and flanking once your guns start consistently deleting health bars and popping heads. Aside from gear, skills are also an important part of your squad's arsenal. Each battle you engage in, you and your squaddies gain experience. Gain enough experience and you can level up and learn new skills. Squaddies peak at level 5 while you peak at level 10. There's a very basic skill tree system for both you and the squaddies, and the skills you pick can change the kind of tactics that you use in battle. For example, an engineer squaddie with a laser turret can suppress large groups of enemies, but has limited range compared to an engineer squaddie with a rocket turret which can hit harder and further. Another example is with Carter's drone ability, where you can either give it the ability to lift enemies off the ground, making them vulnerable to attack, or to give it a healing function. You can tweak Carter and your squaddies to fit your preferred playstyle, which does add some gameplay replayability and pre-mission considerations. The overall gameplay and mechanics are reasonably good, but the lack of imagination when it comes to arena design really holds it back. Environmental hazards are few and far in between, if they exist at all, and there's not a lot of opportunities for you to use squad abilities to exploit map quirks. While the game does mess around with elevation and flanking positions reasonably well, it's definitely missing that X factor which would have set it apart from all the other games of its genre. Now, we've talked at length about the hows of the game, now let's talk about the why, as in the game's campaign. As I've said earlier in the video, you take the role of Agent William Carter, who is recruited into XCOM by by director Myron Falk, to help fight a covert war against a secret alien invasion that's raging across the world, though more specifically for you, America. Carter is assisted in his fights by a cast of supporting characters like Agents Weaver and Da Silva, who are XCOM's two premier field agents. And then there's Barnes, the Sky Ranger pilot who's always got your back and looking out for you. Doctors Weir and Dresner, the brightest minds dedicated to understanding and defeating the alien menace, are also important members of the cast, and Director Falk, the secretive leader of the entire operation, ties the whole thing together. As a whole, Carter and the rest are working hard to stop the aliens from invading Earth, but there's something more to this whole debacle. A mystery surrounds Carter, and he's seemingly too good as an agent. And it's not just because he's the main character. As the story unfolds, you'll find Carter getting dragged deeper and deeper into this whole invasion maelstrom, and it doesn't help that for some reason, the alien leaders have started taking a personal interest in him. The campaign's going to take you all over the continental United States, though never to any of the major cities. This is, after all, a covert war that's barely being held in check. What you'll be traversing are mostly small towns, farms, a national park or two, and later on, alien facilities as you start taking the fight to the enemy. Many times, when you visit one of the many locations that have been taken over by the aliens, the old horror DNA from before the project got rebooted shines through, and it adds so much to the game's atmosphere. Short snippets of everyday people and how the invasion affects them turns what otherwise would have been generic alleyways and corridors for you to pass by into real locations with history in it, be it in little notes, audio recordings, or even just the aftermath of whatever the hell happened to these people. It really drives into your head how bad the situation is and how much worse it'll get if you don't stop it. It really does add quite a bit of charm to an otherwise bog-standard cover shooter of the era. In your off time between missions, be it major story missions or minor side ones, you're hanging around Site X, which is the big bunker in the middle of nowhere that XCOM operates from. There's actually quite a bit to explore here. The idle chatter from the bunker staff helps flesh out the world better and gets you a feel for how desperate XCOM is getting over the course of the war. There's talks about entire regions going off the grid or towns disappearing from the face of the earth, also mentions of other XCOM agents never returning from missions, and then snippets of information suggesting that this is happening all over the world. The campaign starts out a bit rough, and nowhere is this felt more keenly in the early sections. Carter and Weaver's early interactions feels rough, and it isn't helped that Weaver got the short end of the stick when it comes to dialogue animation. The game rushes past the initial alien attack to get you settled with XCOM, and it's not helped that almost all of the world building is told as opposed to being showed. You see very little of the outside world besides in the missions you play, and since most missions take place in rural or small towns, it can be hard to get a good feel on how bad the war is. You only get to see the US Army struggle against the aliens like twice. Once in the first mission and the second time in an optional side mission. Compare this to the Mass Effect games that the Bureau clearly took plenty of inspiration from, and you can see a very stark difference. In the Bureau, it's a few desolated, depopulated towns and alien factories dominating the landscape, but rarely do you ever get to see the people panicking, or you don't see hordes of refugees running away. It's always the aftermath of the destruction or of the situation at hand, and while it's terrifying stuff, once you really think about it, you don't get to fully wrap your head around the horrors of the war. It's also especially baffling that you're somehow supposed to believe that all of this calamity is somehow kept secret and hidden from the rest of the world by XCOM. The game's world building will stretch your suspension of disbelief to its limits, and I fully understand if some people break and just can't accept any of it. Which is a shame, because despite the bodged world building, the main plot surrounding Carter, it's not all too bad. It's even, dare I say it, pretty good. Any further discussion in the campaign's finer details is going to have to dive into spoiler territory. If you do want to get into the game, I highly recommend going into it blind, since the twists and turns in the main plot is best experienced if you don't know what's coming for you. If that has piqued your interest, feel free to skip to this timestamp for the review's conclusion.
Attack! Let's go!
Are they all gone? Alright. The ultimate reveal that you, the player, are not actually playing as Agent Carter, but instead playing as an alien that was possessing him, actually caught me off guard on my first run. It wasn't something I had expected from an otherwise mediocre game. There was some genuine care and subtle writing here. One that I didn't see coming initially, but on my second playthrough, it was also obvious. Carter's file says he was down in the dumps. He's gotten lousy, he's now a drunkard, and he frankly isn't fit to be a field agent anymore, and yet when the bullets start flying and the invasion kicks off, he's somehow outperforming even senior field agents. He seems to have a good grasp on how to fight the enemy, and he has a knack for guessing what the enemy's plan is with what little information he can get his hands on. It starts out early in the game when a squaddie asks what the alien machines seem to be for, and Carter quickly suggests that they're meant to transform Earth into the alien homeworld. How the hell did he know this? Now, on a first playthrough, someone might just see it as ham-fisted exposition from a mediocre game, but replaying the game with the foreknowledge that Carter was possessed, suddenly it's all different. This happens repeatedly over and over again as the campaign progresses. Carter seemingly knows a lot more than he should. He's more competent than his history says he should be. Normally one would just chalk this up to ludonarrative dissonance. You know, the thing where the video game says one thing about the protagonist, but then the gameplay shows otherwise. This time it's not. The dissonance is intentional. You were supposed to notice the discrepancy between how characters talk about Carter's past and Carter's performance in the field. You were supposed to notice how hyper-competent and talented Carter suddenly became. You were supposed to notice that there was something strange about Carter, because you are what's strange about Carter. Conceptually, it's a very simple twist, but it manages to inject so much more intrigue into the game. Once it all sinks in, you really start thinking about the implications of it all. Were any of the relationships, the friendships Carter formed with the other members of XCOM real? Is it even Carter's relationship? Or was it yours? Sure, it may have been Carter's body and voice, but it's you who called the shots and made the decisions. When you get expelled from Carter's body, he's a completely different character. A far cry from the driven, though sometimes cynical and sarcastic field agent who was at the vanguard of the war effort. The true Carter is much more like his file. Paranoid, down in the dumps, and irrational. Doubly so due to having been a prisoner in his own body for so long. When you end up picking a different host for the final mission, he's out there trying to stop you. Because frankly, he's absolutely convinced you're no different from the other aliens invading Earth for their own means, and can you blame him for it? Sadly, this is about as interesting as the game's plot gets. The previous issues I mentioned in the non-spoiler sections really does hurt the game's campaign experience, and the game's length also doesn't help. The Bureau is a bit of a short game. You could probably finish this in a day if you really felt like it. There are 7 main missions, each lasting roughly an hour. And then there's 7 side missions, each lasting between 15 to 30 minutes. While this means the campaign and story can feel a bit rushed at times, there's also something to be said about a mediocre game that doesn't overstay its welcome. The Bureau might not blow your mind, but in my opinion, it's not going to bore you to tears either. All in all, the Bureau is a bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, it's a perfectly serviceable and on occasions thrilling third-person cover shooter. On the other hand, it's so bog standard and unimpressive that there's no guarantee you'll remember anything about the game a month after you've completed it. Well, maybe except for that thing I mentioned in the spoiler section, but aside from that, the Bureau really doesn't have a lot going for it. That being said, I reiterate, it's not a bad game. It's not a good game, but it's certainly not bad. I certainly wouldn't recommend paying full price for this game. I mean, I sure didn't. I got my copy from some giveaway almost half a decade ago now, but it does go on sale for $4 every other major Steam sale. $4 for a day's worth of entertainment is pretty reasonable. And that about wraps up this review. If you want more of this kind of content, feel free to subscribe. I make both reviews and commentaries on various video game subjects. I currently have a few other reviews in the back burner that I hope will catch your interest. It's all just a matter of figuring out which one I want to work on first. Anyways, this is about the end of the video. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, share, and all that good stuff. This has been Cheems of Regret, reminding you all that you're nobody till somebody loves you. And that somebody is me. I love y'all. Signing out.
Making more of them! Oh! Alley-oop! Get behind cover! Moving! Repositioning! I'm ready!
Nice job, Carter.
We're not through it yet.